Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for showing up in such a large number. It's my first in-person talk in, I think, more than 2 years, so I'm very excited. And it's also going to be the first time I ever live code in front of any audience, really. So we'll see how that goes, and bear with me should anything go wrong, but I do, of course, have a backup. Yeah, my name is Kilian. I'm here on behalf of a small company called Inlinity, which we just founded, which is working on using explainable AI to open up new areas of application for AI systems, especially in areas where black box models are just not acceptable due to regulations or other risks. And I'm also speaking on behalf of the XAI Studio, which is our innovation lab that we run together with the University of Ulm, where we prototype and explore user-centric explainable AI systems. You can find the Jupyter notebook, which I'll be scrolling through and coding in, on my GitHub, which is at ionicsolutions/Grokking-LIME. You can also find me on Twitter. This GitHub repo should also be linked in the abstract, which you'll find in the program. And so let's get started. When we talk about explainable AI, for short XAI, sometimes it's also called interpretable machine learning, it can be quite confusing because what do we actually mean when we say that? So just to give you some definitions, or the way I think about this is that we do have, usually when we're working with machine learning systems, we're usually faced with opaque models or the standard black box models. So we do have some input, there's a black box which does something to the data, and then there's an output, and everybody's super confused why this even worked. And on the opposite of that spectrum, we do have something which is sometimes called a white box model, an interpretable model, or transparent model. And that's the idea that we might also have a model where we know quite precisely how the input was mapped to the output, because we can actually look at these equations, for example, that were used. And I would argue that actually all black box models are also somehow transparent and interpretable in a certain sense, because of course we always know what kind of mathematical equations are inside of them, and the main problem is that it's just way too many. So we do have millions or even a couple of thousand parameters, and even 100 parameters are usually too much for humans to comprehend. Even experts have a hard time simulating such a model in their head. And so what can we do instead? Well, we can just look at another example which we know from real life, and that's just something which everybody carries within their head, right? So our brain is a black box. We have absolutely, or at least I don't have any idea how my brain works. I certainly do not know how your brain works, but nevertheless we are able to communicate, and I can hopefully convey some information to you and explain something to you. And so the idea of explainable AI would be to, instead of just giving an input and then an output, to also provide some sort of an explanation which helps us comprehend why this output came about. And that, of course, sounds like a nice idea. And if you're like me, a couple of years ago, you wonder, is that actually possible, and how does that look like? And that's the question I would like to answer today. But before we dive into that, I would like to introduce you to the 4 principles of explainable AI that have been published by NIST, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, just last fall. And in my opinion, it's not really 4 principles, it's more like a definition and then 3 requirements. But I find this framework to be super helpful also in my daily work, thinking about this, designing these systems. And they define an explanation as something which delivers or contains evidence or reasons for outputs and or processes. And you can already tell that's super broad, right? That could be a sentence, that could be a plot, that could be a flow chart, anything really. So we already get an idea that maybe explanations can take very different forms from what we may be used to when we first hear the word. And these explanations have 3 requirements which they have to fulfill, or which you need to keep in mind when you're designing them. The first of which is they have to be meaningful. And that's something which I, coming from the user-centric part of explainable AI, just cannot stress enough. It doesn't matter whether you understand or believe that you understand an explanation, or your entire team of data scientists understands it. If the intended consumers of these explanations don't understand them or take away the wrong conclusions, they're absolutely useless, so you always have to put the users first and put them at the center of attention. The next thing is more on the technical side, which is the explanation accuracy. Or in other words, you should not lie, right? So if you generate an explanation, it should reflect what's actually going on, and you shouldn't just give like other reasons for a certain black box decision, but they should in fact match what the model is doing. And then finally, which they call knowledge limits in this framework, is something which most of you who have been working in machine learning for some time will know, which is that, for example, even a machine learning model can only operate under certain conditions, and usually these are conditions that closely mimic the training setting. There might be models which you are able to transfer, but we all know that we then need to very carefully check whether that's the case. And we have probably all tried to like push a model to its edges and ended up in these like really weird parts of the model output where it's just statistical artifacts and it doesn't have to do anything with what we're actually trying to model. And with that said, what I'm going to do for the remaining 20 minutes of my talk is show you how we can create such an explanation in the very particular example of an image classifier. And we do not need a lot to do that. The only things which I'm going to import in at the start are NumPy and the Python image library, because we need to open some images and want to look at them. And here, this is really just for transparency reasons. I'm also defining a number of helper functions, which will then later help us look at different intermediate outputs that we're generating. I just couldn't memorize them, and I didn't want to spend time typing them up live. And with that, we can start loading an image, right? So we have everything that we need. We can just load an image and then also look at it. And I've selected an image of a camera. It's just something like, it's one of the test images I've been using. And so that was, quite useful to just go with that. And then we'll convert it immediately into a NumPy array, because we're going to work in this array space today. The thing to note here is, so the image has 224 times 224 pixels. We have 3 color channels, red, green, and blue. And so this means that we have about 150K values in this 3-dimensional tensor. And we can look at them. So we just by selecting like random pixels, we can see that these are integer numbers. They're between 0 and 255. So it's the standard 8-bit RGB image format. And now we, of course, need an image classification model, and I'm going to be lazy here, and I'm just going to import something which ships with TensorFlow. It's a mobile net that is pre-trained on ImageNet. And this has the advantage, for the sake of this talk, that it's not a large model and will run reasonably fast. We can just, as always, ignore these warning messages, and then we'll go ahead and actually predict something. And this is just the model.predict function, which we're calling. There's also a preprocess input function, which just comes along with that model. It takes care of like rescaling the image. It's not really relevant to us, because, I mean, for us, it's a black box, right? We shouldn't know anything about that. We just get the promise that whenever we put in an image, we'll get a prediction out. And the prediction in that case is a vector of a length 1,000. So we put in one image, which is why we just have like one output. And then we have these 1,000 additional numbers, and that's the prediction. So for each of the 1,000 classes that the model can distinguish, we have one entry in that vector. Let's just look at the first 10 just to get an idea of what this looks like if you've never seen something like this before. So it's really just a number that reflects the likelihood, for example, in this case, that this image shows something which is associated with class 0, whatever that is. And in order to figure out what class or what this model sees, in air quotes, in that picture, we can find out which index of that array carries the maximum, has the highest value. And it turns out that 759, which is a number that you should remember. We're going to need that later. You might say, well, this is completely meaningless to me, and it should be meaningful what we're doing, right? So let's decode these predictions, which is also something that comes along with that model. So we can map this number or this index in the output of the model to some human understandable term. This function was also provided along with a model, and it turns out the model believes it's a reflex camera, which is, I would say, accurate, and it also assigns it a very high likelihood, but it might very well also be a CD player, a cassette or loop, or a cell phone. And now the big question, why? So we have no idea why that is, but we want to find out, and this is where LIME comes in, or methods like LIME come in. And LIME stands for Local Interpretable Model Agnostic Explanations. It's fairly old in terms of like today's XAI methods, was published back in 2016 and really helped jumpstart this entire idea of extracting feature importance explanations from all sorts of machine learning models. And just to give you a roadmap of what we're going to do now, so LIME consists of 6 steps. The first of which is to segment the image. Then we'll generate some samples from these segments. Then we'll generate some images from these samples. Then we will run a model prediction on these generated images. And then we will be able to fit a linear model to the samples and the predictions. And finally generate the visual explanation that we're looking for. And because we do not have a lot of time, let's jump right in. First things first, we're going to segment the image. And just to remind you, this is what the image looks like. And what do I mean when I say segment the image, and why are we even doing that? I already mentioned that we have like 150K pixels, and of course we could just like explain it pixel by pixel, right? So which pixel in this image is relevant for the model's classification decision? But for us humans, and remember we want to be meaningful, pixels are a very strange concept. But for example, for us, the upper right-hand corner of that image is something which we would consider to be the background, right? That's just like one shape for us. And so as the input to our explanation, we want to mimic that. And this is where we can use so-called segmentation functions, which are available, for example, in scikit-image. That's what I'm using here. And the only reason I'm not typing this out is that I cannot remember how to spell the name of this person that presumably invented it. And this function allows us to create what is called a segment mask. And so we just take this function, put in the image, and then we generate a segment mask. And what is a segment mask, you ask? Let's first have a look at the shape. That's always useful to see what shape it has. And it has exactly the same shape as the image, just minus the 3 different color channels. And we can also look at this, because I've conveniently prepared a function to do that. And this segment mask, why doesn't this work? It's missing the image. Right, so you can see that it now like marks all the segments that we have generated, and we see that it's a little bit better than pixels, but not quite nice. And so we will just add some scale factor, and that's, as far as I understand, really just a number, and the higher the number, the fewer the segments. And of course, there are lots of other hyperparameters which we could use, but for now, we'll just go with that. And then we see when we put it at about 300, we see that like the shapes that are selected as segments are kind of mimic what our eye would also see in that image if we had to like draw borders. And finally, we can also have a look at what the segment mask actually is. This is, as we saw, an array of the same size as the image, but instead of like having these pixel values, for each pixel, it tells us which segment ID this pixel belongs to. So for example, the upper right-hand corner, all of these pixels up here will all have the number 5. So later we can find these segments. And this also allows us to find the number of segments by just taking the maximum segment ID and adding 1, right? So we're starting to index at 0, and so we have 94 segments. And equipped with that segment mask, we can now move on to the second step, which is to generate samples. So why do we want to generate samples? Because we cannot look inside the model. We need to send the model some new images and try to figure out like which parts of the image or which segments were actually relevant for the prediction. That's what we're going to find out. And so what we need is the number of segments, because we will need to randomly sample across them. And we just learned that it's just the maximum number in the segment mask plus 1. And then we can go ahead and generate these segments by randomly sampling or generating first a random array, which has the number of samples, which is again a hyperparameter, and the number of segments. And then we will just keep the ones where this is above 0.66. So like in every image, in every sample, we'll keep a third of the original segments, and everything else we'll replace in the next step. And then we have these samples. We can generate them. This didn't work. Samples is not defined because I typed segments. This looks much better. So we have 128 samples times 94 segments. And we can just use pandas data frames because they are nice to look at, and look at what we generated. So we do have something which has 128 rows, and then for each segment we do have a column, and if there's a 1 in the column, that means we keep the segment, and if there's a 0, that means we will throw away that segment for that particular sample. Okay, next step. Now we have samples. Now we need to generate images because our model understands images. And so we will need to create images where we want to turn every segment that's not in that sample into a black area or into a black shape. And so we're going to go through. So for each sample in the samples, first of all, we're going to create that mask, which just has zeros everywhere. And so the shape has to be the same shape as the segment mask, because that's the same size as the image. And for reasons which will become apparent later, I will just change the d type to integer. And now we can go through, and now we have to look at each segment, right? So each segment ID, which we have, so each unique segment ID which we have in the segment mask, which is going to be 0 to 93. We will go look inside the sample whether there's a 1 at that position. And if there's a 1 at that position, we'll go ahead and we'll flip the mask from 0 to 1. So everywhere where the segment mask is equal to the segment ID, right? For example, in the upper right-hand corner, everything will be a 5. We will set this to a 1. And then we can go ahead and generate an image, right? So we will go images.append. And now we're going to multiply that mask with the original image. So we will keep the original value when there's a 1, and we'll remove, and it will just turn to 0 when there's a 0 in the mask. And because the image has this color channel, we'll also need to do some, we will need to add an additional axis before we do that multiplication, otherwise it won't work. Then we can define this. Why doesn't this work? I'm missing an if. Great. And then we can generate these images. And so we have 128 RGB images. And in order to see how this looks like, we can use this show image function and then just look at some number. And so you can see that this is an image where certain segments have been blacked out. We can do that again. I'm just like randomly walking through. And so you can see that we have like distorted images. And you can already tell that maybe the strategy we're using here is not the best. So maybe we would want to like always cover the same area of the image. So take into account the size of segments. There are all sorts of things you can do, and this really depends on how your model behaves and what images you're using. But for the sake of this presentation, we'll just take it the way it is and then just move on to the next step. So we have 128 of these images, and now we can actually ask the model what it thinks is in these images. So we will run model.predict. We shouldn't forget to pre-process the input, otherwise funny things will happen. And then we will put in these images. Wait a couple of seconds, and then the model is done predicting all these 128 images, and so we have 128 predictions times 1,000 classes. Great. This so far has all been preparing things as an input for the most important step, which is the fit of a linear model. And so what LIME is doing, which is also what makes it unique, for example, compared to other techniques, is that it's trying to fit a linear model around the original image and tries to figure out which parts of that image contributed most to the classification. And so we're essentially approximating this very complex multidimensional model with a very simple linear one. And the choice of which linear model you're using is also a hyperparameter. And we're using Bayesian-rich here because it's relatively robust, and it also doesn't try to bring all the prefactors or coefficients down to 0, which is what happens, for example, if you put in an L1 norm, usually you don't get any explanation at all. And just to remind you, we had these samples which we looked at above, and these will now come into play again, was the second step that we did. So we do have these vectors, and what we would try to figure out is like, what's the prefactor for segment 0, for segment 1, for segment 2, right? Is it actually relevant to have that? So what's the coefficient if we try to see what's happening? And then another thing which I will not go into much detail, also considering the time, is that we, as I said, we're going to approximate the model in the vicinity of the original image. And so this means that we need to know how far away our samples are from that original image. And I'm just going to be lazy here, so I will just take the norm. So I will just essentially try to figure out how many ones are in my sample, and the more ones I have, the closer I am to my original image. If you want to be more meaningful and also be more accurate, what you should do is you should actually calculate the similarity between the images, for example, like by comparing color channels, subtracting the images from each other. There are lots of things you can do, but for now, this will be sufficient. And then we can fit this linear model. And the X is easy, that's just going to be the sample, so we want to know which of these segments is important. And then the output is going to be the predictions, but not any prediction. But if you remember, it's 759. We want to know, why does the model see a camera in that image? We could also ask, why does it see a cassette, for example, or why might it be a loop? And then we will add the sample weights, and there we will just use these similarities. So the more similar we are to the original image, the higher the weight. I hope I didn't make a typo. That looks good. The fit is already done, and we get coefficients out. And the coefficients are just these 94 prefactors for the different segments. And you can see that they are like, they're small numbers. They're usually around 0. They can be negative. They can be positive. And this output is what we would consider to be an explanation, right? So we know which segment is contributing positively or negatively to this image showing a camera according to that model. But that's not really understandable. It's also very hard to digest. And so we can also generate a visual explanation from that. And for that purpose, I'm going to use, I'm not going to code this up. I will use a function from a package which is called Visual LIME, which we developed as part of this XAI Studio, because we wanted to have a LIME implementation which is really meant for humans to look at. And sadly, the original implementation of LIME doesn't do a great job at giving you a lot of control over what the output looks like. And so I'm just going to import that render explanation function. Here I'm going to put in the original image. I'm again putting in the segment mask, right, because we need to know like which segments to color and where they are. And I'm also going to add the linear model coefficients. And then I would like to have the most positive coefficients in green and the most negative coefficients in violet, which means that we're going to see which parts of the image contributed to the model, to the model believing that there's a camera on the image, and vice versa. And let's see how this looks like. So that's, I think, it's a decent example. And what you can already tell is that you in your head also already probably start to try to like interpret what you see here. And for example, we can see that there's something like around this lens body. This seems to be important, this entire area on the left. So the flash also seems important. And that's actually also a problem with these computer vision visual explanations, is that they still require a lot of interpretation work on behalf of the person looking at them. And also, if we now run this again and again, you will find out that like the way that this was set up here, you will get different explanations each time. And it can be quite instructive to like generate them again and then look at them, and you will always find very good reasons why this is a correct explanation. That's really interesting, like from a scientific perspective. But of course, that's not what you actually want. So if we were now to really develop a proper explainer for the setting, we would run this several times. We would try to make it stable so that we always highlight the same segments and really go back, for example, to the segmentation function, tune the parameters of the ridge regression. Try to color different parts of it, or maybe like normalize the coefficients before we plot it. So there are lots of different things you can do, but I hope that you got a fairly good understanding of how like the different steps that LIME is using. And if you go out and look at similar methods, you will find that many of these individual steps, maybe in a different order, maybe slightly like with a slight variation, but they all tend to reappear in these black box explainers. And with that said, I'm almost out of time, so I'd like to thank you all for attending today. If you would like to have a look at the notebook and also find some additional information, go to ionicsolutions/grokking-lime on GitHub. I've linked the papers here. They are also on the GitHub, and I've also, there are also two LIME implementations. One is the original one, which you can also use on tabular data, and then one is this Visual LIME version, which is, which was crafted and designed and developed to be really efficient and to give you a lot of control in the context of computer vision. Yeah, now I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks for the question. The first one is, what's the main difference between LIME and SHAP, if you know that?
Yeah, so the brief answer is that SHAP is a mathematically more rigorous version of LIME. If you look there's a paper by the authors that eventually published SHAP, which is called An Unexpected Unity Among Feature Important Explainers, or something like that. I think it's a 2016 or 2017 paper from Scott Lundberg and others. And they, for example, they examine LIME and, for example, methods like deep lift, which you might have heard about. And they show that they really all are approximating something which is very similar. And if you take the most rigorous approach, then you end up with what is known as SHAP in the machine learning community.
Okay, then the next one, what's your favorite explainable AI library?
That is difficult because my impression is, so I did my PhD on that topic, and so I know a lot of like these academic research implementations. And my feeling is, which we're also tackling as in Linity, or like in my startup, is that there's, as far as I know, I would be happy to be proven wrong, that there's no, for example, there's no like scikit-learn of explainable AI or like a PyTorch of XAI yet. I would say, like in terms of deep learning explainers, I would have a look at Captum, which is developed by Facebook for PyTorch. And that's, I think, the first example I know of where they really sat down apparently like a bunch of proficient engineers and had them code up all these algorithms in a very consistent manner. But I don't have a favorite one-stop shop for explainability.
Okay, next question. Do you invest in user studies, for example, on Mechanical Turk, to see whether people actually can better understand models with explanations?
Yes, we do. That's what essentially my entire PhD was about. And that's also what we do in this XAI studio, where we really try to take these algorithms and also look at different questions that are out there, and especially working with lay users, and to really make sure that people understand these explanations, or what we do most of the time, show that explanations which data scientists believe to be good explanations turn out to be super confusing to everybody, and users don't like them.
Okay, next question. This sounds like we are creating an explanation algorithm and tinkering with it until it creates an explanation that seems plausible for us. Isn't that overfitting?
Yes and no, because it depends on how you do that. So there are two things, and the first thing, like the first step, would be to make sure that it's like a technically sound explanation, which also brings in this technical accuracy part. So if we now run this again, we will get a slightly different explanation or something which is widely different. And so the first thing to do is to figure out what are the parameters that we need to always generate the same explanation, because then we can reproduce what we're doing and arguably get closer to the truth in a way. And then it's really about taking these coefficients, which we calculated up here. So this is what we would do. For example, we would make sure that every segment is always negative or always positive, but doesn't flip a lot or stays very close to zero. That would be something to look for. And then we would go ahead, once we are happy with these coefficients, and then start to generate images, show them to users, and figure out do the users take away the correct conclusions or not? So it's really user testing, similar to how you would test your GUI applications.
Okay, and then last question, do you think the explanations could also help as an input to downstream models?
Sure, in principle, yes. So I've never worked on a use case like that, but I could imagine that, for example, if we think back to the previous talk for those who've attended, where it was about like highlighting segments of text and then extracting these highlighted areas from an image. for example, I could imagine that, that something like being able to explain why your image recognition algorithm thought that this was like a highlighted segment of text, that this could help that it could help with the downstream processing.
Okay, and then one came in. What is the advantage of LIME compared to a rather naive approach to feeding individual segments into the original model and comparing the logouts or the probabilities?
So the advantage is that depending on the number of samples, you get a really good approximation of the model, like in a space that is very closely, that is like, or in other words, I mean, what you're essentially doing is you're mapping out the decision boundary or approximating it in an area which is very close to the input. So you have this linear approximation, and that's arguably more powerful than just like randomly sampling, because we're actually fitting a model to it.
Okay, that was the question. Thank you for your talk and for your work. See you around.